Order, order, and welcome to the Scottish Affairs Committee in our third public evidence session in Scotland's space sector. And today we have the people who are going to be putting these rockets into space, which are now allowed to introduce themselves and anything by way of a short introductory statement about their business and operation. We'll start with you, Mr. Coates.
I'm Martin Coates. I'm the CEO of Orbex, or was until
this morning, it looks like.
Indeed, correct. I'm now just a main board director, but still with full executive responsibility. So Orbex is aiming to produce the most eco-friendly launch vehicle and spaceport that it can. It's a vertically integrated operation, so we don't run the spaceport separately commercial. All the capacity we intend to use for ourselves. The launch vehicle itself is aimed to put 150 kilograms to 500 kilometres orbit, and we're well on our way to having that ready to go in the near future.
And could you pass on our congratulations to your new CEO, who I understand is Mr. Philip Chambers, yeah?
Right.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hammond.
Thank you very much. So I'm Scott Hammond. I'm the Deputy CEO for SaxaVord Spaceport. I think really my responsibilities, though, have involved leading on all the planning, so all the environmental impact assessments, all the design of the spaceport, and also leading on the license applications, all the safety analysis, etc. We are now a licensed spaceport. We received our license back end of last year for up to 30 launches a year for rockets that can put 1,500 kilograms a time up into space. That is a massive step for the UK and Scotland, huge capacity, huge capability that we can now do from Shetland. We're aiming to do launches this year in the summer, working on that, and I'm very hopeful that the committee here will come up and visit us to see all of the progress that we've made up there. So we are a vertical launch spaceport.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Oxley.
Hi, I'm David Oxley. I'm Director of Strategic Projects for Highlands Enterprise. Highlands Enterprise is the Economic and Community Development Agency for Scottish Government, which covers the northern half of Scotland. And I've been involved with the development of Sutherland Spaceport initially, and looking to support the development of the space sector around the whole of the Highlands and Islands, as well as SaxaVord and Sutherland. We have two other potential spaceports in Machrihanish and Spaceport 1 in the Western Isles.
Can't forget those ones, of course.
Absolutely not.
And we're grateful, thank you for that. And just to you first, Mr. Hammond, congratulations first of all on getting your CAA licence. And I think the committee is all wondering what happens next. I think you said something about an expectation that there may be these Tartan rockets going into space sometime around this summer period. Would that be roughly the timeline?
Yes.
Could you maybe just explain to us what happens now? You've got these licenses. Obviously, there's interest in making use of the facility. Could you maybe just explain to us what you expect to happen?
So it's important to realise there are 4 licences you need to put a satellite up into space. One is the Spaceport licence, which is what we've got. The next is a range licence, and that's effectively like air traffic for the launch. So it's the airspace through which you fly and over the sea over which you fly. We're expecting to get that in the spring of this year as well. And then the launchers themselves have to have a licence, much as BA has a licence to operate. So the launchers, and I suspect Orbex in this case, are applying through the CAA for that. We'll expect our launchers, in this case both Rocket Factory Augsburg and HyImpulse, to hopefully get theirs towards the summer. Then further on, you need the satellites also to have a licence, and that's also from the CAA. So we're at that stage. For us as the spaceport, we now move into what's called the monitoring and oversight part of the process. So this is where the CAA come along and make sure that all things we promised to do, we're actually doing. So it's very much now we get into the grown-up phase.
We'll ask you specific questions about your relationship with CAA and your views on the regulation, but is it roughly working just now? Could you just, from the outset?
We're very, very pleased with it. We find the CAA very responsive. We have fortnightly meetings with the leadership. We've built a very professional relationship with them. My view is that the amount of scrutiny and how much they looked at us was entirely proportional to what they should be doing. got to think, we've built a spaceport, and building a spaceport, it's going to be up there for 30 to 50 years. If you were going to start to license Heathrow, it would be a completely different thing. You'd expect it to be pretty rigorous as you went through it. So we have nothing to complain about on that. And we would expect all spaceports to go through that rigorous test.
Well, that's really helpful. And thank you very much for your very kind invitation for this committee to come and visit your facility in Unst. I think we're all keen to do this. I think we're actually it's work in progress about trying to get up and seeing if we can actually visit your site. So thank you once again.
We also have a gin distillery, if that helps.
Well, these sort of incentives always work with thirsty parliamentarians. So I'm pretty certain after that comment we'll make sure we can get up there. But thank you for that. But can I just ask in general, I mean, everything seems to be going pretty well. We're now looking at the prospect of, like rockets going from, well, particularly from SaxaVord, hopefully this year. What makes Scotland such a particular and attractive destination for these type of facilities? And I'll maybe ask you that, Mr. Coates, given that you're not all that far behind and you're looking obviously to make sure that you make real progress. But what have we got in Scotland that helps us develop
first
these
and
facilities?
foremost for spaceports, it's because you can do the orbits that you want to launch into. For us with Sutherland, it's mainland, which makes it a lot easier to get things to and from the launch site for both us and for the payload provider or buyer, whichever way you look at that one. So that you've got that kind of physicality that's essential, because you can't launch from many places in Europe at the end of the day. The other aspect is the ecosystem of the existing satellite system. So being able to access skilled workers. So we've recruited about 120 people into Forest now, most of which are all highly skilled engineers, and we've been able to track those people from all over the world into that location, as well as hiring sufficient local skills where appropriate. And the oil and gas industry actually helps into that as well, because there's a lot of transferable skills from that sector. And our health and safety manager comes from a brewery as well. So we've got all sorts of useful transferable skills just in the region.
This session's getting better and better, which is good to hear. And can I just ask you, Mr. Oxley, get things kicked off? I mean, just how is HIE supporting the development of the Scottish launch sector? What are you doing specifically to enable this?
Our interest in this is really more about the jobs than the space bit. So I'll probably come from a slightly different angle to Scott and Martin today, in that we got into looking at the space sector for very specific reasons, mainly around Dounreay and at some point there will be 1,000 jobs lost at Dounreay as that nuclear facility closes, and that has a huge negative impact on the economy of Caithness and Sutherland. So we were looking for opportunities to develop and create new, good technical skill jobs, and that's how the thought of launching from Sutherland came about. So HI initially took forward the Sutherland Spaceport project and then passed it over to Orbex a few years ago. But increasingly we've recognised that as an economic development agency, we're fighting for jobs against other parts of the UK and other parts of the world. And when you've got a geographic advantage, it makes it a hell of a lot easier.
And all the facilities other than Prestwick are Highlands and Islands, aren't
right.
they? Yeah,
absolutely.
And you're up against, obviously, interest from the rest of the UK. And how are you able to...
So if I just take it back to a non-space example, if we were trying to create a call centre somewhere, that is really challenging when you're in a population of less than 500,000 in the whole of the Highlands and Islands, as opposed to Glasgow or London for a call centre. If you're doing space, and particularly launch, you have to be in the north of Scotland to do it if you're going to be in the UK. And this is a really important aspect of the UK space economy, and Scotland leading and being almost the PR machine. We all know there was launches today in America which got a huge amount of publicity. Whenever the first launch in Scotland happens, it will be a traditional vertical launch, and that will be really attractive to it, and it's really important to think about those sort of things.
And just lastly from me before I pass on to colleagues, and it was touched on by Mr. Oxley, do you think that the UK and Scottish governments have the right space strategy and the right range of ambitions in place? And we'll ask you first,
wow.
Mr. Hammond.
You're opening a can of worms there. It's good the UK has published a space strategy, and so has the Scottish Government. I think I would like to see a little more resources behind it, because otherwise it's just paper, really. For me, there's almost too many cooks involved. I think what we need to look at is having a senior politician directly responsible for space and space launch, and I would suggest that at
We've not got that
cabinet level.
We've got,
no, it's rather difficult to know who's actually running launch here in the UK, and I think we need political top cover for what we're doing. If we come on to the Scottish government, because it's not devolved, the area where the Scottish Government can help us is with the Marine Directorate, because we have to have a licence to deposit stuff into the sea. Now, we've got to be realistic here. The Marine Directorate was never set up with that in mind at all. So it's completely new to them. And we really need that sort of political oversight and top cover to empower the civil servants to do things slightly differently so as we can get those marine licences. They should only take about 14 weeks. They're currently taking up to about 6 months because it's brand new. And I'm not criticising the Marine Directorate because it's brand new, but I think a little bit of your time as the political oversight and top cover would be very advantageous.
Well, we will be talking to UK and Scottish ministers just about that very point. But just interested in your views on this, Mr. Coates. How do you see the respective strategies and the outlined ambition?
Yeah, I mean, having a strategy is good, and I know it's being worked on to have an uplift in more specifics. To echo Scott's point here, that knowing exactly what you're going to supply in terms of resources to put behind a strategy, I know is coming downstream, so that's all good work. And I'd also echo the point about joining things up. So if you're going to put effort into space, then everything kind of needs to be supporting that, not necessarily to ride roughshod over sensible objections and proper checks and balances and all those things, but to make it clean and simple to get what we need done in what is a brand new sector.
Thank you. Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. So as a committee, we visited Spire Global and AAC Clyde, and obviously they put CubeSats into space. Now, they were very clear that it would be advantageous for Scotland to have that end-to-end capability. So I suppose to yourself, Scott, how important is it that Scotland does have that end-to-end capability, or does that even factor in your rationale and what you're doing?
So I think it is very important. It's getting the whole value chain into Scotland. There's no doubt about that. As I'm sure you're aware, Glasgow, Spire, Clyde Space as they used to be, they build more CubeSats outside of Silicon Valley over in the States. So we have that capability. Don't forget also Edinburgh. Edinburgh's really good for making sense of all that space data. What we don't have is the launch capability. So you've got companies like Orbex and Skyrora here in the UK who are going to hopefully provide that, and we can launch from Scotland itself. I'd like to broaden it out a little more, though, from Scotland. Our customers coming to us are from Germany, they're from France, they're from the US, they're possibly from South Korea, from Spain. So we're very much an international entity, and that's where we can bring in that foreign investment into Shetland, our spaceport, and the wider economy. So it's really important for Scotland, but think wider, that we can actually be a complete leader here in Europe. And we come back to, we have a spaceport license. We are the only vertical launch orbital spaceport in Western Europe. That's a massive opportunity. So I would like to think bigger and dream bigger.
Okay, and you already said in answer to the Chair that you think there should be a lead politician in charge of launch. But in terms of this developing end-to-end capability, is there anything else the Scottish or UK governments should be doing?
I would like to see launch contracts. That I think is the way. We've had up to now grants, and I don't think those have worked particularly well. I think there's issues with oversight in grants and how they are applied. If we had the launch contracts, that would allow companies to bid for them. You'd get a good deal for the taxpayer, and from a company's point of view, if I've got a contract directly with the government, I can leverage that and borrow against that. So I would like to see more contracts given and have the government as a customer more than the grant giver.
What would the government as a customer get out of providing a launch contract? And interestingly, the CubeSat companies would like to see government buy more services off them as well, but what would the government get from providing a launch contract?
Well, what they need to do with that, I think, is look at what do they want the satellites to do. I think Department of Environment could quite easily put some satellites up to aid all of our activities to help with the UN, etc., etc. So you'd actually be putting a satellite up there. The sheer fact, though, that you've got the UK or Scottish government, it could be them, because they're not that expensive, these launches. It would hold first of all the industry to account. It would show that government is serious about what they're doing, and I think it would really a real sort of encourage the whole of the industry and young people looking at the industry to see that we're getting direct support from governments.
Would it need to be a multi-launch contract? I mean, let's be honest, not all launches are initially successful, so would it need to be a multi-contract?
I'm sure Martin and I would love a multi-contract.
And can you put a figure on it?
10.
Oh no, I mean a financial figure on like what a launch contract, say an individual launch contract, how much money we're talking about if that was...
So it's generally, and I think Martin's probably better to answer this, they do a price per kilogram. And it depends at the moment where you look in the market, but you're probably looking at between $20,000 and $30,000 per kilogram. So depending on how much you want to put up, that's how much you'd pay. So it would be different. But as I said, Martin would be able to give you an idea of what you're going to charge.
Is your cue, Martin?
I suppose one thing to observe on the sort of price per kilogram view is when you're doing it just on a price basis, you'd go to places like SpaceX because that scale of rocket is cheaper per kilogram, other factors notwithstanding. So we're not into a price competitive piece. That's why we're on the eco, the convenience and all those other factors. So we'd be looking at launches somewhere north of £7 million at each launch, regardless of what the payload actually is. So that's kind of what it costs to put one in, and that's the all-in, including the operation of a spaceport, of course.
Do you think you'll get there without, say, a government launch contract, or would that government incentive help yourselves as well?
A government incentive always helps, because I'd echo Scott's comment. If you've got a government relationship, it gives you a bit of gold braiding when you're out talking to other investors. Are we going to fail if we don't get it? No, but it would make life an awful lot easier.
And do you have anything to add in views of that end-to-end capability for Scotland, or anything else that needs done to see that
the extra
through?
bit that you get sort of ratio perspective with Spaceport and launch vehicle at this scale as well. Once you go up into larger launch vehicles, it's even more skewed, but it's something like about 10% of my development budget delivers the Spaceport. 90% of it goes into the launch vehicle. So 120 jobs sat in Forest are all highly skilled engineers working primarily on that, including the launch system for the launch itself. So it's that wider ecosystem I draw your attention to, because those people are paying tax and living and spending money in Scotland, and then that creates a cascade through on that side of the economy. The other thing we're trying to do is source everything we can in Europe, UK preferable. We ought to look at a commercial view, and at the moment the only thing I can't buy in Europe is carbon fibre at the quality that I need it. Everything else, one way or another, I think I can organise to source.
Would you mind not just a little bit more,
sure.
Mr. Close? It's a big old echoey
room. No problem. Everything else I can source in Europe and a lot of it in the UK. So we're trying to put all the manufacturing facility in Scotland, and there's a scale that we're operating at today, but to actually get into production when we're trying to produce one a month and going upwards to 30 or 40 a year, that is a significant facility that has cascades all the way through, because we need ancillary companies to support that kind of supply chain. So that kind of ecosystem is the broader piece that I think about, and you go into the training, where are the skills and technicians and engineers going to come from that feed into that in order to support that kind of run rate. That is quite an ambitious undertaking for Scotland to be looking at.
You got a timescale for how you see that?
Sorry?
You got a timescale for when you see that ecosystem in an ideal world come to fruition?
We would have to be starting to plan our main manufacturing facility early next year. We will already be starting to say, what does that need to be? How big does it need to be? What's it going to employ? Looking on a 5 to 10 year horizon, all the jobs, all the equipment, everything else that needs to go in that.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. We'll just move on to back to yourself, Scott. Just some questions specific to your own proposals or SaxaVord's proposals. So why did you choose Shetland as opposed to anywhere else?
It's a really good question. It comes back to why Scotland, and it does come back to geography and physics. So if we want to go into a polar orbit, you don't want Earth spin. So you don't, ideally, you'd be up at the pole because there's minimum Earth spin up there. Now, that's a tricky place to operate. So the analogy here is you've come up to a really strong river. You want to swim across the river and get to that point there. If you just point at it, you'll end up downstream. So you actually point up and you do a longer bit of swimming through the river to get to where you want to. And it's exactly the same with Earth spin. You don't want it. You have to counter that Earth spin with fuel, and that reduces your payload. So that's, first of all, good high latitude, and Shetland is as far north as you can get in the UK. The next thing you're looking at is the actual launch trajectories themselves, because you want them to be direct to where you want to go to. So just as when you go across the Atlantic, you'll fly the Great Circle route, which minimises the amount of fuel that you need to use and therefore maximises the payload that you can carry. So where we are, we have direct trajectories. For Sutherland, we would compare it to them. If they can get a safe launch trajectory, which I think is a big if, they will still have to do doglegs, which is going to cost them payload. So that's really why Shetland is in such a good position.
Okay, thanks. Obviously, you've been successful in your licence, which is great news. The licence allows up to 30 launches a year. How long, realistically, I mean, is 30 launches a year a realistic proposition? If so, how long to get up to that type of frequency?
In this industry, everything depends, but if we look at last year at Cape Canaveral, they've done about 66 launches, and they're gusting about 70 to 80 for this year. So it's going to take time to get there, there's no doubt about that. We would hope to do it in 5 years, but certainly in 10. I think the difference for us, of course, is we are a multi-user spaceport, so we're not just having one company launching from us. So we're going to have 3 pads, which we're currently building at the moment. Again, if you look at the rest of Europe, the only other likely pads for orbital launch are going to be in Andoya. So that means they're going to have maybe 2 up there. So we are going to have 60% of the launch capacity here in SaxaVord. Beyond that, we've got room for other pads, which we'd need planning permission. We could start to look at those. So it's going to take a bit of time, but we've got all of these companies coming to us, and we don't have a marketing budget. We don't need to market ourselves because the companies do their research, they do their homework, and they come to us. Okay,
thanks. You said earlier on there that you're working closely with CAA and you've got a good working relationship there. In the wider kind of airspace, there's a move towards airspace modernisation, and some of the airlines and airports, to be honest, are saying that the modernisation programme's taking too long and they need to see it speeded up. Does that have any long-term impact on yourselves as you look to increase frequency?
I don't think it is. So we've got an airspace change ongoing at the moment, which should complete in the summer of this year, and that will give us a large amount of airspace, up to about 350 kilometres to the north of us. So we will have that all in place. If there is the airspace modernisation, in any way, it's likely to help us because it will make far more flexible use of the airspace. At the moment, it's a bit, with set aside areas, danger areas, a bit clunky. So we would support that. I would say though, again, airspace change, that's a 3-year process, and that's a lot of time and money invested into achieving that. So it'd be nice to see it sped up, but again, you've got to think of all the other users. You know, you can't deny airspace to other people who need to use it, like the airlines.
Thanks. Just one final question. So, before Christmas, there was reports of a contractual dispute with the development. Have all these matters been resolved? And that's not a barrier to, obviously, your time frame in getting that first launch?
No. So we're just about complete on Pad 1, which is where Rocket Factory House we're going to be launching from. We're completing the stool on that. The hangar is being completed at the moment with the clean rooms within it, and we'll be bringing in all the range infrastructure. So, no, we're absolutely confident we will make the timescales. I think for me, always the worry would be, are the launcher going to get their launch license from the CAA? I don't see us as being the long pole in the tent.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, yeah.
One of the things that we heard at several of the sessions that we've held on this is just the importance of the end-to-end, as it's described, from manufacturing to launch. Is this going to be truly transformative for Scotland, or is there particular issues that we have to sort of think about in order to ensure that we do have this success, given that we now have this facility available?
I believe it's going to be transformative, but then I'm going to say that, aren't I? As Martin said, there's very, very few places in the world that you can build a spaceport. So, we have a massive opportunity there. And yes, we can, with Orbex and Skyrora, build the rockets in Scotland and perhaps in the UK. But let's think, again, dream a bit wider, bring in all of the European launchers and become a European spaceport rather
would that be your ambition then, is to try and solicit that business from Europe?
Absolutely.
And be seen as the prime...
Yes.
That's a big ambition, isn't it? Have you got the facility, you got the resource to be able to try and ensure that's at least a possibility?
We believe we have. Clearly, government help is always advantageous behind that. That if government believes that we can be that in Europe, I think that's a massive thing, and we can do, because at the moment our real competition's Andøya in Norway. And we need to be faster to the market than them and be more responsive and agile, because, we are trying to drive down launch costs, because ultimately that's how we're going to get business. So I do think it's very achievable, and we already have a office in Munich, because we see a lot of our business coming from Europe.
I think, David, then Christine, do you want to come in there?
Just very quickly, in fact, I had a very quick 2 or 3 technical questions. You just answered one of them. One of them was going to be where your competition is, because when you look at the map of the world, you're looking for polar launches, which is basically straight up. Top of Shetland or Sutherland makes absolute sense. So you said Norway and one other. What was the other one?
Or Norway, there's another one in Sweden, S-Range,
okay.
but that they've got some issues.
I guess you have to strike that balance between how accessible it is as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever been up to Andøya, but it's well above the Arctic Circle, so it's a difficult place to operate.
I've never been further north than Trondheim.
Oh, well, okay, well, yeah, it's further than Trondheim, so it is a difficult place to operate from.
So you mentioned earlier how the Sutherland launch, and this may be a question for Mr. Coates, how the Sutherland launch requires a dog leg. But again, just looking at the map, I was just wondering where that comes in, why that's a factor.
Well, it's at this stage it's an option on some of the launch trajectories. It's not for all of them, and it's not actually certain, because at the time we're heading towards those islands, we're doing Mach 10 at about 800,000 feet. So it's a more of a statistical game that we're not getting.
Which islands are you talking about?
Sorry?
Which islands?
You're going over the Faroes.
All right, okay. All right,
Yes.
so the trajectory would initially take you towards the Faroes, but you'd have to deviate from that.
Well, but one of many.
Right, okay.
So there's a lot of other trajectories we can use. That has a certain set of advantages, but it's by no means essential. And as I say, at the moment, it's by no means essential that we actually have to do a dogleg either.
And from SaxaVord, does Svalbard come into the equation, or are you already up above?
No, Svalbard doesn't. Okay, you need to sort of draw it back. Effectively, the first 60 seconds of launch are probably the most hazardous part of that. And while you could be, once you're, let's say, you're over the Faroe Islands, you're not going to hit the Faroe Islands because you've got a forward throw there. So if, the rocket exploded, all of the debris would still be doing Mach 10, so it's going to go a long way north. So actually, for the chances of hitting the Faroes, it's actually much earlier in that launch sequence, because if it was to explode, I don't know, because I haven't looked at the trajectories from there, say 20 seconds after, then you're probably looking at debris falling on the Faroes. So, having gone through the whole process with the CAA, we've done our sighting assessment, we've done all of the analysis, etc., and all of the algorithms we've used. If those are applied to Sutherland, they're going to end up doing a dogleg. I cannot see the CAA licensing that. In addition, you've got to look at mature systems versus immature systems. So all the systems that are going to come to us are going to be immature, and Orbex, Skyroar are immature launchers. So when you then do your analysis, you put in a greater probability of failure into that, which then leads to the statistics whereby you're going to need a dogleg. So, I've not done it for Sutherland, but everything that I know from having, performed it for SaxaVord leads me to you're going to need to do doglegs, certainly for sun synchronous. Polar orbits, you've then got the issue of the people who actually live just to the north of the launch site. So,
And just one last question. Was going back to your introductory remarks about the need for a senior government minister responsible for space. I was looking back in the briefing paper where it lists the various different departments that are already potentially involved. Department of Defence, Business and Trade, Department for Transport are obvious ones, but you've also mentioned the environment. DEFRA, for example, would be very interested in the kind of data that would be coming back. At the moment, with the greatest respect to my ministerial colleague, Andrew Griffiths, it's a relatively junior role within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Would you, and open to all witnesses to remark on this, would you see that as being solely a space-focused job, or can it work as part of other responsibilities? Anyone?
Either of you?
I think it was Mr. Hammond, it was yourself.
So, I think it should be sort of cabinet type of level, and bring them all in together, because that whole space strategy, what is there's jobs, there's the effect on putting up environmental, climate change, there's defence. You need everybody in there together, and with the greatest respect, you're the politicians, you know how you have to beat each other to get things done. I suspect you need somebody...
Only do well, that's why we're asking you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you need somebody on top of it, looking at the whole of the space strategy and making sure that it's happening, and bringing in people like the Ministry of Defence, etc. Are you angling for that job?
I no comment.
It's a good job to have, isn't it? Secretary of State for Space.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion anyway. Christine Jarrett, you want to come in?
Thank you very much. Mr. Coates, if we could ask you, first of all, why Orbex chose Sutherland and see it as the most promising spaceport location?
Some of that predates me, which David might help me with, but it's the mainland location is one of the most driving factors for us. It's 3 hours drive from where we are. You don't just have to move a launch vehicle, you've got to put a lot of people there too. So being able to have people move between without being camped out in remote places. Other operators might go out of French Guiana. If you heard a rocket lab, they go all the way out in New Zealand from California. So there's a lot of other costs hidden if you have locations that are further away. And so it kind of sits with our environmental credentials as well as commercial convenience as well.
Okay, I accept the point you make about the mainland, but Sutherland is still quite remote, is it not? Yes. So you recently submitted changes to your planning proposals for the spaceport. So when do you anticipate the spaceport will be operational, and will those planning changes have any impact on timing?
Well, there is an impact on timing, but the main change was to improve the ranging option. In the previous submission, it was thought the antenna array would need to be lower down, and we need a second one. But with the option of using Bentong, which already has a set of antennas on it for different purposes, we don't do any more damage to the environment than we have to by putting those things up, and B, it gives us a much better ranging site, so we only need one. So that's why we've chosen to do that. It's the planning rules that meant that we've had to resubmit the whole thing, and we've now reduced the footprint of what we're having to do on the main spaceport as well, which is another overall benefit too. So some very important changes, but we're still able to carry on with pre-agreed work on things like the road and the pad and so on, because some of those things haven't actually changed very much at all.
So when do you anticipate being operational?
That should be later on this year.
Sorry?
Later on this year, the spaceport should be complete. Yeah.
Are there pros and cons to your own situation with Orbex, having the same company operating as spaceport operator and the launch provider?
There are pros and cons. The primary con is you've got a hell of a lot more to get through as a day-to-day job of understanding all of the different factors. But the pro in having a full control of the entire integration of how the spaceport is designed and all of the integration through the launch system and the launch vehicle makes it a much safer operation for us to run as part of our license, as well as for us in terms of knowledge transfer and ensuring there's no misstep between the two businesses. So we run it as a single unitary management team, that there is no, well, there's a separate legal entity for it, but there is no separate management board managing the spaceport separately.
We're going to come on in a minute to talking about the importance to the Highlands and Islands enterprise. But we've talked a lot about end-to-end and how important it is to have an end-to-end space programme. And one of the significant parts of that for me as an Edinburgh MP is the amount of work which is done in Edinburgh. And academically, industrially, all of that. Can you give us, both yourself and Mr. Hammond, some idea of what you anticipate the impact could be on Edinburgh, not just of having the spaceports, but and the rest of Scotland for that matter, but bringing in international opportunities to that?
I can maybe come in here if that's
certainly.
okay. I can see Scott and Martin squirming a little bit at that particular question. So when High were undertaking our options appraisal on Sutherland, we did an economic impact assessment as we expect us to do. And for Sutherland by itself, this is, over the next 25 years, this is £1 billion economic opportunity. A lot of that will be across the supply chain. And we're talking about launch, we've been talking about launch most of today, but that's a relatively small aspect of the overall supply chain. The data analysis, which is what Edinburgh is really good at, to the data lab and lots of other high-tech companies there, that's where a lot of the money has come. So I can't give you a figure, but it's a pretty big percentage of £1 billion opportunity for one spaceport.
So that would be a significant benefit, principally to Edinburgh and data analysis, but to other parts of Scotland as well.
Other parts of Scotland, and that's, we're doing this. I'm doing this for jobs for Scotland, jobs for the Highlands and Islands primarily. That's my day job, but I'm not going to be taking the view that you get to Perth and we're not bothered about the jobs. If there are jobs in Perth, Glasgow and Edinburgh because of what happens in the Highlands sounds great. It happens vice versa as well.
And presumably you're working closely with Scottish Enterprise.
Absolutely, and SDI in particular on the international opportunities, the inward investment opportunities which Scott referenced earlier. I think that end-to-end capability will attract European and potentially American space companies to come to Scotland to set up a business. And how big that business is will depend on what part of the sector they're in and what they need. So we already have Skyroar and Orbex making rockets. There could be others that come following on from that. More and more satellite companies in Glasgow, more and more data analysts in Edinburgh. Yeah, there is a huge opportunity for the Scottish economy as part of the UK economy.
Thank you. Well, I have you, if you like. Could you tell us a wee bit more specifically about the role that HIE has played in developing and supporting a Scottish spaceport?
Yeah, so this, my first involvement in the space sector goes back to, I think, 2015, 2016, when the CAA were looking at options for a horizontal spaceport. And at that time, I was looking after the Murray area, Mr. Ross's constituency, and one of the options for a horizontal spaceport was the former RAF Kinloss base, and that's where that sort of initial interest in is there an opportunity for space in the remotest parts of Scotland came from. That gradually developed into opportunities around vertical launch, and that came through Sutherland. As I've said previously, the impact of the significant population decline we're anticipating in Caithness and Sutherland, and ways to address those demographic challenges in particular. So we've, since that time, as High, we took the Sutherland Spaceport through its planning process and all the various judicial reviews and court cases we had to go through to get past that, to make sure we were doing the right thing. And then following on from that, we have tried to work more closely with all of the spaceports to see the opportunity that's coming out here. There is significant opportunities. I see each part of the Highlands Islands having a specific opportunity. So in Machrihanish and Argyll, it's very much about the engine testing side of things. They've got a huge former RAF base where you can test an engine and nobody can hear you or see you or disturb anybody. Spaceport 1 is very much looking at suborbital flights. Sutherland and SaxaVord are much more looking towards orbital and potentially suborbital in SaxaVord. We're trying to get this cluster activity working together, trying to get all of the spaceports working on things that are of general interest. So we haven't really mentioned skills yet. I'm sure that's a question that's going to come up at some point, but everybody needs to benefit from a skilled workforce that comes up, and I think we can do more on that side of things.
I suspect that Mr. Ross is going to come in a second, but I wanted to ask a bit about how you've been deciding where to target the investment in spaceports. You touched on skills, and one of the major problems in the Highlands over the decades has been depopulation, young people moving out. Highlands and Islands University was a response to that. How significant do you think this will be in reversing that, the developments with the spaceports, the clusters you've talked about? And how important is that in your decisions about where to target investment in the spaceports? So
I think that space is a very attractive sector. It gets people's attention. If we were talking about other sectors that were creating as many jobs, it wouldn't get as much attention. But it is a huge thing that gets everybody interested in the region. And as we've talked about before, the geography plays to our advantage in this case. So there's definitely an opportunity there. I think that will it be attractive for folks coming into the area? Yes, we've seen that. I've worked in economic development for nearly 20 years now, and you have to have the right opportunities for people to come and live and work in there. Space will attract folks, but I suspect Martin and Scott are recruiting people in that are part of families, and you need 2 jobs, not 1. So we need to diversify the economy much broader than space. Renewable energy, hydrogen, food and drink, tourism, all these other opportunities that we have in the region to develop the economy further.
Presumably that's one of the places, or is it one of the places where the UK and Scottish governments could do more to support the project by encouraging other investment?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think there is a lot of attention on space this year in particular. There's been a lot of attention every year for the last 4 or 5 years when we've been expecting a launch to be not too far around the corner. But I think we are really at the point where a launch is going to be happening in the next 12 to 18 months.
Thank you.
Mr. Ross indeed wants to come in.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. And just for full transparency, I think I should say Orbex is based in my Murray constituency. Mr. Hammond hosted me when I went to SaxaVord as a Highlands and Islands MSP, and Mr. Oxley was previously area manager of HIE in Murray. So a very strong Murray link panel and Highlands and Islands link.
We could have had the meeting in Forest.
Exactly. Well, we could have done that. That would have been very useful. Can I maybe start with you then, Mr. Oxley, to follow on from what Christine Jardine was asking about the selection of sites. obviously a lot of interest throughout the Highlands and Islands, but the two principal ones we have with us today. Why did HIE put so much focus on Sutherland rather than SaxaVord, particularly at the start? And do you accept some of the criticisms that there has been that you maybe put all your eggs into one basket with Sutherland, particularly early on?
Okay, so the High Board took its decision about investing in a spaceport back in 2018. At that time, we considered business plans from Shetland Space Centre, as it was termed then, Spaceport 1 and Sutherland, to look at the potential for each of those. And at that time, based on the business plans at that time and the decisions that were made then, it was decided that Sutherland Spaceport was in a better place back in 2018. That's what, 6 years ago now. Things have moved on significantly. I think the two...
Was it the right decision at the time?
Absolutely, it was the right decision at the time.
And in hindsight now, looking back, could you have separated more of the resources and the support to ensure we get to the stage we are now to have two very close to vertical launches?
It's great to have two sites that are close to vertical launch, and we've always been open as an economic development agency. We cover Shetland, so we've always been open to supporting SaxaVord Spaceport. In fact, we have supported SaxaVord Spaceport. We've invested nearly 200,000 in various initiatives to help SaxaVord Spaceport, and we're in current discussions with SaxaVord about further opportunities that may come. So we recognise this as a key opportunity sector for the region, and we're willing to work with any of the spaceports that have got realistic, sustainable business plans, and that includes the two that are sitting to my right.
Do you think any of the criticisms then early on were unjust, or was it about how you explained that decision-making process to support Sutherland more than...
There were concerns raised which were investigated and were found to be not valid. So we did a thorough process to do that. We are the custodians of public funds, and we take that duty very seriously, and we don't make decisions without an assessment of best value for the public purse.
Mm-hmm. And then can I come to Mr Coates and Mr Hammond? I've listened to you both very carefully, and you seem to get on well, and you're obviously both very interested in space, but there's been a wee bit of needle as well. Mr Coates has mentioned twice how Sutherland's factually a mainland spaceport, criticising potentially Shetland, not criticising but showing the difference, and Mr Hammond, you're pretty certain it's going to need a dog leg, whereas Mr Coates doesn't necessarily think it does. Are you healthy competitors? Are you bitter rivals? Is there enough business to have two spaceports, not just in Scotland, but in the Highlands in the far north of Scotland?
Well, I'd say yes, and we're not really competing because I can use all the capacity I've got in Sutherland for my own business. I don't need to have a secondary operator on that site, so we're not putting it out as a commercial offer in the way that SaxaVord is, so it's a completely different business model. And of course, the current capacity that we have permission for is not sufficient for our plan. So we're going to be launching elsewhere it's relatively soon, but in the years that it takes to do things in space, that isn't necessarily soon in terms of Parliament. So we may well want to be a customer of SaxaVord in the future. Who knows? Or Andoya. There is plenty of demand capacity. And we see it with a building pipeline of inquiries almost every week. There's a new company talking to us about potential launch opportunities.
So if SaxaVord launches before you'll be cheering, and if it's Sutherland, Mr Hammond, will you be cheering and supporting what Orbex have done there?
I'll be surprised if they're before us, but you never know. We are different, there is no doubt about that. Do we need two vertical launch spaceports? No, we don't. We've got 30 launches a year with launches that can do up to 1,500 kilograms. So that's 45 tons we can put up in space, maybe 300 satellites a year. So we can account for the demand up in SaxaVord. I don't see that we need to have these extra spaceports. We talked about engine testing. We've done engine testing up in Shetland. We've had both Latitude and HyImpulse doing that. And for them, they like to come to the spaceport to do that engine testing, because then they learn about the spaceport, they build those relationships, they understand all the health and safety processes and procedures that we put into place. Suborbital, we can do suborbital as well. Again, a lot of the companies, HyImpulse is a good example of this, they want to do the suborbital launch from us because, again, they learn how to operate from SaxaVord as they move to vertical. So I think we've got to get away from this, we've got to have spaceports everywhere. I just don't think you need that. You can see if you look at America, America's got about 40 spaceports. Of those, only 14 are actually licensed. And last year, of those 14, only 3 actually did any launches. So there's this great desire to spread the love. You achieve nothing. So I think we only need SaxaVord spaceports, certainly for the next decade. We'd be delighted to have Orbex come and launch from us. I see no need for this sort of dissipation of resources.
Oxley.
Well, back in February 2021, Highlands entered a market study with some well-known market analysis of the space sector. At that point in time, the market analysis indicated that accessible launches from the UK over that next decade were approaching 1,000 potential launches. So even if Scott gets to 30 launches a year and Martin gets to 10 launches a year or 12 launches a year, there's plenty of capacity out there. So there's more capacity than we can go at the moment. And that was February 2021, when a lot of companies were launching from Kazakhstan and Russia. They're obviously not doing that now, and they're not going to be doing that anytime in the near future. So the market for launch in Western Europe has grown even more than the fact that when we did that report 3 years ago. So do we need more than one spaceport? Yes, I think we do, because there's a lot of market to go at, and the UK and Scotland should be trying to capture as much of that as possible.
We like to simulate debate amongst our panellists, and I think that's certainly done that. So I don't know how we then come to a conclusion as a committee, but we'll certainly keep an eye on that going forward. Can I look at the skills element of it, which I've raised not just in this inquiry, but we've done a number of different inquiries looking at defence, shipbuilding. We're looking at science. In many ways, a lot of these different sectors and industries are trying to attract and recruit the same people with the same skills, but particularly in Scotland, but indeed across the UK and indeed many parts of the world, we're fishing in quite a small pond for significant numbers of people. Is this an issue you have in your risk register that you don't get? I mean, very pleased obviously with the numbers employed out of Forest, but is there a risk that ultimately 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, we don't have the people with the appropriate skills to continue the work that you are creating at the moment? Mr. Coates.
There's always going to be a risk. It's in how big you think that is. But because it is such an exciting place to go do engineering work, and Prime is just our first vehicle, not the one and only that we're ever going to do. So there's always going to be a demand for highly skilled engineers, and we get 700 people applying for 12 intern places, and you can have a first-class grade from the best universities and you won't get through that screening program. So we're pretty sure there's one level of it that works, but as you're creating more and more jobs, then you're going to want more of that feed coming through from universities like Edinburgh and others that already have a space school. So yes, it's a risk. Are there things in place that are mitigating that? Yes, there are today. Do they need to do more? Yes, because we're going to demand more and more of those skills. But that will lift everything around it as well.
You mentioned earlier there's a lot of transferable skills with the oil and gas sector, and you recruit people from there. Yes. Likewise, the Scottish Government and others are saying these people in the oil and gas sector at the moment can transfer into offshore renewables. So they are being drawn in several different directions, and I wonder, how big a risk is that? So maybe come back on that, maybe to both you and Mr. Oxley. Is the Freeport Cromarty a positive, a negative, or neutral? I mean, is there a chance that actually people that could be going a bit further north to Sutherland actually stay closer to Cromarty because of the financial benefits of working for businesses there?
I'll maybe answer that one for Martin. I'm involved with the Green Freeport in Cromarty as well. I get all the nice, easy stuff in my job as Director of Strategic Projects. In terms of the jobs that are going to be created at a spaceport itself, you're talking dozens of jobs in either Unst or in Sutherland, and not all of those jobs are top-level quality rocket scientist engineers. In fact, I very much doubt there'll be any rocket scientists in Sutherland, but there will be engineers, there will be security, there will be facilities management, there'll be accountants, there'll be a whole variety of things. So I think we need to just broaden the skill set to thinking it's not just engineers you need in there. You need a variety of jobs in there, and you will need to get those. So I think they will. I don't think that's a challenge for either of the admittedly remote locations for these to attract poor folks in there, and that's what we want to do. In fact, I could see opportunities where families come back to the area is because of those opportunities that are there. In terms of the Freeport, that will create thousands of jobs, I'm sure, in the Highlands Islands, as Ms. Jardine mentioned earlier. The Highlands Islands has suffered from depopulation for decades, and my organisation's job is to try and reverse that. So,
all three of you, do we have the infrastructure for this influx of jobs, either into the spaceport, to the Freeport, to people working in a number of different industries? When I was in Shetland, one of the biggest things that came up was the lack of available housing. So if we don't have the infrastructure, we can do everything we want to create jobs to encourage people to come to the Highlands and the islands. But if there isn't the schools, the doctors, the dentists and the housing, we're not going to get them.
I'd say from the short piece of knowledge I have on that, I think that's an issue regardless of space, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think it's a general issue that needs to be addressed by
when
government in general.
Orbex at the tail end of last year with Minister Hammond, that was one of the biggest issues we spoke about in terms of recruitment. In fact, I think your manager there was driving through from Aberdeenshire on a daily basis because it was easier for him to get a house in Aberdeenshire than it was in Murray.
Yes, that's still happening, yes. Yeah.
So Hammond?
I agree, it's a chicken and egg, isn't it? But we need to encourage the people to be working, up in these locations. You talk about the skills. When we go out to hire people, I can't go and hire a safety person for a spaceport because they just don't exist in this country. So we look at the transferable skills. We look at what other people have done. So we very much employ the person and then train them. I think we'll be doing that for a few years. I'm hopeful that children who are currently in school will see in Shetland the opportunity that they can go into the space industry because they can see it happening up in Shetland, so there'll be more staying up there, and perhaps we'll stop that drain to start with. But it's going to take a bit of time to turn around that supertanker, I would suggest.
I think on your point about housing in particular, Mr. Ross, the Highlands and Islands has not got enough houses at the moment and needs more, but opportunities like spaceports, like green freeports, give that confidence to builders to look, maybe not building speculatively, but being on that bespoke to speculative range, to be more on the speculative side of things. When if they know there's going to be hundreds, thousands of jobs coming, then they're more able to invest further. And that's what we've not had. And you've got declining populations. It's been more challenging for builders to invest. It's a matter of fact, it costs more to build a house in many parts of the Highlands and Islands than it does in the Central Belt or elsewhere in the UK. So we need to try and bottom that, square that circle, and that's an ongoing discussion. Every time we meet with businesses across any sector, housing is the number one issue.
And a final question, if I can, to Mr. Coates and Mr. Hammond, different to you both, looking at the local aspects of your businesses. You've both been asked about why Shetland and Sutherland. Mr. Coates, why Forest for Orbex? Because obviously you are still 3 hours away. We're delighted to have you in Murray and at Forest. You've obviously got the facilities at the Enterprise Park. And I presume also the opportunity to utilise Kinloss Barracks. Was that important in terms of your decision making for Forest? And then for Mr. Hammond, can I ask about the discussions that are currently ongoing in Shetland about replacing the ageing ferry fleet with tunnels? What difference would that make to your proposals and the operation of SaxaVord if we had fixed link between the islands rather than relying on the ferries? So two separate questions.
Yes, okay. Yes, I mean, having Kinloss 5 minutes away for doing engine tests and integration tests and all those other things is obviously a huge part of the decision. But the main thing was having the space to expand, and we wanted to be near enough to the spaceport itself, but in a location that had better communication links. You've got Inverness Airport, Aberdeen's not too far to drive, and further out, of course, you can drive down to Edinburgh or Glasgow, pick up further flights from there. So location-wise, it was extremely good for us to have all of that combination come together.
Thank you.
Fixed links is very much on the agenda for everybody up in Shetland, and we see ourselves as an enabler towards that. You know, we add to the whole business plan or business justification for those fixed links. The ferries currently, you know, we can certainly use them. They're not sort of a limitation on any of our operations, but obviously a fixed link would be, you know, a far better and more reliable way of getting to the islands. So I would see us as, you know, contributing to the business justification for those fixed links.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chair.
Alan Brown wants to come in. Alan.
Thanks, Chair. Just back to the numbers game that Douglas had brought up. And Mr Hammond, obviously your licence allows up to 30 launches per year, but you're saying there earlier on that Shetland alone would be able to meet the demand, but Mr Oxley was saying HIE have estimated they could, you know, Europe-wide there's demand for 1,000 launches per year. So surely that means there is enough demand that would justify spreading the love, as you called it, in terms of other spaceports in Scotland.
That was 1,000 launches over the next decade, not 1,000 launches per year.
But even then, 30 a year.
Even 100 a year is still a lot.
Yeah. You know, 30 a year doesn't meet that at all, if you know what I mean. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're a private company. You know, it's our money we're investing, etc. So, you know, we listen to these reports and everything. We talk to all of our launch providers. A launch provider will tell you they're going to do 20, 30 launches a year, but a lot of them are fishing in the same pond. So you have to take a lot of that with a bit of a pinch of salt. You know, I would be delighted if we were achieving 100 launches a year. I don't think we're really at that scale quite yet. So, you know, as I stick with, you know, my view is that in the next 10 years, we can deal with that capacity out of SaxaVord.
Can I just ask before I hand over to Mr Duquette? I mean, you guys are here as representatives of the interest in spaceports across Scotland, and there's another 3 obviously that are still in the reckoning, and I think this is mainly for Mr Oxley. We've got, I think, 2 of them within the HI area in Euston, Macahanish, that's right?
Yeah.
And obviously there's Prestwick, and given what we've heard here and Mr Ross's attempt to make out brotherhood and love between the 2 of our witnesses, are these other 3 spaceports in with any sort of chance then, given where these 2 are, and what we've heard just about capacity and maybe over-resource?
I think they've got their own niche of the market to go at. I suspect Macahanish is not going to launch anything. It is going to be engine testing and maybe some of the aspects around that. Well, that's a good niche to have. I think Spaceport 1 has some opportunities to develop, but also some challenges to develop. They're probably, at the time back in 2018, they weren't that far behind the other 2 spaceports in their thoughts, but they're quite a distance work behind at the moment. That can be brought up to date.
Is there any way that Scotland could accommodate 5 spaceports?
The market, who knows how the market's going to grow, to be honest. Our reports have said that it's going to hockey stick up, and I think it will continue to do that. Satellites are getting smaller. The whole model that some of the spaceports are now operating is a taxi service rather than getting on a bus and going somewhere vaguely where you want to go to. This is a taxi service takes you exactly where you want, and you'll pay a premium for that. Yep. So I think there's the number of satellites that are being launched every year is growing year by year. The number of places you can launch from is still going to be limited. So I think in the long term, there is opportunities for more. How quickly it will take to do, it will depend. There's a lot of focus on the first launch. I'm not interested in the first launch. I'm interested in the 20th launch, because that is when you've got a sustainable business. That's really important to me.
Okay, thank you for that. David Duckett.
Thank you. There's a lot of discussion there about the link between Forres and Kinloss and Sutherland and the Freeport at Cromarty. And I was just wondering if either of either Martin Coates or Mr Hammond, do you see the North East Scotland investment zone as being something that factors into your plans going forward, either for Sutherland or for Shetland? Given that we've already spoken about how difficult it is to get people to come and live in these areas, it's difficult enough getting people to live in Banff and Buchan, to be fair, which is my constituency. But I'm just wondering if there's been any view of taking advantage of that investment zone for North East Scotland at all.
We certainly looked at it as being part of the Freeport with Aberdeen, and it's something we looked at, and we supported that particular bid.
Combined with Peterhead.
Yes, so we're more than happy to do that and look at that. Anything that can help us, clearly we're interested in. So after it didn't win the bid, I can't say we put too much thought to it, but if you've got something else on the table, I'm sure we're happy to talk about it.
Okay. Mr Coates?
I don't particularly have an opinion on it because it predates my involvement in many ways. What I would say is that there is the focus on the Spaceport company or the launch company, but there are ancillary business services that we need to buy in. So it may not be of direct interest to us, but it may well be for other supply services to operate out of those areas. So I wouldn't rule it out as an interesting aspect.
Mr Wishart was already talking about what I was going to ask you about you next was just how viable multiple launch facilities are going to be in Scotland. I'm not going to repeat the questions and answers that have already been given. But once we've seen a successful first launch or multiple successful first launches from different sites, again, for Mr Coates and Mr Hammond, what's your business model for moving on beyond that to ensure that long-term viability?
Okay, I'll come in. So we're first, we're not just a spaceport. We also have ground stations where we bring the data down. We've got about 8 already up in UNTS that are operational. We aim to widen that around the globe, looking at places in Alaska, in Finland, etc. And that's all about diversifying our business. Further on, I disagree with David a bit in that satellites are getting smaller. We're actually seeing an increase in the size of the satellites. And if you look at people like Rocket Factory Augsburg and everything, they're actually looking to make the rockets bigger. And the sweet spot was probably around 250 kilograms 2 or 3 years ago. I suspect it's now between 1,000 and 1,500 kilograms as the payload capacity. So I do see a change going on. And that's where we've got to be agile, because we have to be able to meet those changes in the market as they occur. And that's one of our big advantages. Being a multi-use spaceport means that should one of the companies come to us and that they're in a niche area that they're not getting any business, we don't get pulled down by that because we've got others that are operating. So, that's how we make it sustainable, is being a multi-use spaceport and driving down costs, because ultimately it is how much I have to pay to put my payload into space that they're interested in. Yes, they want to go when and where, but you can't, charge a huge premium on that. So that's where we are, is being reactive to the market and delivering for our customers.
Mr Coates, for Orbex, moving forward?
Looking forward, the Prime on its own is a viable launch vehicle at the volumes that we've been talking about, but where we go to engage next is things like the ESA challenge that was just announced in December, which is talking about creating a much bigger European space industry, and that would be where we'd be looking at the next launch vehicle. And yes, we have ancillary services around the whole thing, not just launching a spaceport, but that vertical control that we have at the moment gives us tremendous flexibility on when things can happen for our customers just for that one launch vehicle today.
And going back to what I think you were both saying earlier about how this could change the face of the European space industry. Well, you're not here to speak for ESA, but you mentioned ESA, so I'm going to ask you. Do you see it being a massive change for them to think about how they're going to change how they look ahead once they've got some one or two or however many launch facilities in Scotland?
Well, the challenge as announced is a major change in its own right. So if they follow through on that, that is a huge disruption in the normal way of procurement within the European theatre. So it's a massive opportunity for companies with ambition, and we intend to be one of those companies that's going to work with them to be a winner of that activity, in effect.
On the subject, I mean, I've already asked about who our or your major competitors would be, or what different countries would be able to provide a similar offer with polar or sun-synchronous orbits, etc. But can you comment, both of you, on what the UK government and Scottish government are doing and what more could be done to promote that longer-term viability? And maybe, if you've looked at it at all, compare it with what other governments in those other locations are doing? Mr. Hammond?
Okay, I think, so we spoke about contracts, but let's get, perhaps the more soft side of it is engaging with other countries to allow us to do what we want to do. So, some of our stages will fall in the Pacific Ocean. So rather than Scott go along and talk to the US government, it's far better the UK government goes and does that and gets those agreements in place. So, the governments can enable by doing that sort of international agreements on stage deposition into exclusive economic zones. They can really help with that. So, to make it far easier for us when we go to those countries and say we're going to do X. So it's really getting the government to understand what it is we want to do, how we're going to do it, and then get them to enable us to do it. That's where I would really like to see some effort.
And Mr. Coates?
Well, I'd add to that with the financial story. If you do compare into Europe, and noting that Germany probably can't have a spaceport, but Italy, France already do have an ability to launch one way or another, but they're investing hundreds of millions of euros into those sectors, and not just necessarily at the launch vehicle, but it's all the other things that you need too. So that whole infrastructure that goes around it, as what does that sector need, is getting a lot more money and attention, and that is something that you should look closely at, because that is publicly available data to support any analysis you're doing.
Is there any particular company or country in Europe in particular who we should be looking at and taking examples?
I would give you those four examples, because they seem to be the ones spending the most money on it and have capabilities like Vega in Italy. You've obviously got Ariane, that's largely the French organisation, but those countries are the ones that seem to be putting an ambition out there to be leading players in this sector. So they're the ones that we are competing against as a country.
And forgive me if you don't know the answer to this, so it's maybe something we could look into ourselves separately, but going back to the conversation we had earlier about having a senior space minister, is there any examples in any other countries, particularly in Europe, that would have that position that we don't currently have here in the UK, that you know of?
I don't know of that. What I would also add is regulations. We need to make sure the regulations are fit for purpose. I've said that we've had a really good relationship with the CAA, and that continues to be the case. I know that the UK government is already looking at any amendments they need to do to the regulations. Where we would like to see the effort put is in making it easier for satellites and launchers to get regulated and licensed. And we probably need to think about, I've spoken about mature and immature systems, is as an immature company comes along, is there a way that we can do maybe just a single launch license, and they don't need to do a full environmental analysis? They could use the Spaceport's environmental analysis and just make sure they're within that. So that would encourage that innovation, bringing in the new companies. So I think that's where I would like to see a fair bit of effort, is looking at the regulations and making it easier for launch companies and satellites to come to the UK and be launched from the UK.
Anything to add to that, Mr. Coates?
I'm tempted to say that Spain has a closer representation to what Scott's talking about, but I don't know the details, so I'll follow up with an answer to your question, because I can quite easily get hold of that information for you.
Useful, yeah.
And so
I was just wondering if, Mr. Oxley, if you've got anything to add to that, lessons learned from elsewhere in Europe or even elsewhere in the UK that you've looked at from a Highlands and Islands enterprise point of view.
I think if you look back over history, apart from New Zealand, every spaceport in the world has had some form of public support from government. That's either through building it. Some countries have built their own spaceports, fully funded through the government. Some have given major contracts through their equivalents of the MOD or the Department of Defence to support those spaceports, and others have given grants. But it is very rare to find a spaceport that has no government support in one way or another. And I think that's the reality. We use satellites every day. Using our mobile phones, that's where the data comes from. So this is a sector that's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to be a great opportunity for Scotland and the UK, and we need to continue to make the best advantage of it. I think it's about coordination. I'm not necessarily saying there needs to be a Cabinet Secretary for Space. That's a great job title, but it just needs coordination. It's maybe just having something that is really somebody that's sitting at cabinet level that has overall responsibility for space and can bring in the rest of the departments that are needed to do it right.
Okay, thanks. More questions?
And thank you all ever so much for coming along and giving us the wisdom and benefit of your experience in all of this. I think there's a couple of things that we maybe follow up, and I think with some quotes, a couple of examples we can get back to this community. But thank you for your time today. And if we could have the second panel, we'll just keep running, if that's all right. This chap hasn't. And this is and anything else that you want in the way of an introductory statement. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, and thank you for the chance to speak. My name is Nick Smith. My official title is Regional Director for UK and Europe for Lockheed Martin Space. What that means is I'm responsible for growth of the organisation across those regions, but I also head up the UK space team for Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin, large multinational corporation, US headquartered, but with a significant UK footprint for 1,600 people plus operating in the UK at the moment. As far as our space division goes, more broadly, it's one of the largest space companies actually on its own right in the world. Significant heritage, every NASA mission to Mars, as well as lots of defence and aerospace and defence type missions from a space perspective. As far as specifically what we've been involved with at the moment is we were one of the recipients of the UK Space Agency launch grants back in 2018. It was actually two separate grants we were awarded. One was to bring a launch to the UK. That means working with a launch provider with some heritage or some proven technology as far as practicable. Bring that to the UK to create a launch, and then a second program was very much focused on building an ecosystem and sort of delivering some of that economic benefit that comes from launch. So thinking about the wider indirect jobs that come from launch. And to that end, we're working with a company who are going to deliver payload that we're going to launch on that first launch, WeatherStream, who are looking at weather data. And our role is really to bring our heritage, bring our broad global oversight, and where we can, expertise to try and help establish that first launch with those entities from the UK. And in this instance, we are going to be launching from SaxaVord.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And obviously, Lockheed Martin, as you said, has got a long history, tradition and experience in this sector. What is it in particular that you've identified in Scotland that you believe will be useful for developing your business here?
I think I'd sort of come back to some of the things we've heard already. I mean, we consider the UK a home market anyway, so actually being involved in establishing the space sector and just being involved in growth of the space sector and the space economy in the UK, we've been investing for some time and we continue to do so. And being involved in launch, we felt was a significant part of that value chain. When it came to finding a partner, I think, as talked about earlier, what's strange about space is incredibly reliant on geography, on terrestrial geography, as much as it is as orbits. And as you've heard, the locations for the spaceports in Scotland have amazing geography for the things we want to do, be that access to polar or synchronous orbit, or as Scott mentioned from a SaxaVord perspective, thinking about operating ground stations. You know, the further north you can get, especially for those LEO orbits, the more utility you get from your ground stations.
Because you were initially involved with the Sutherland Spaceport, weren't you? I think that your relationship goes back to 2018, and you subsequently now changed your mind or opinion. You've explained that. I think. Is there anything else you want to add to why you felt it was necessary to change?
It was the decision at the time. We found both ourselves and Orbex were looking at Sutherland, and we had competing requirements just because of the nature of what we wanted to do and how we wanted to set up the spaceport, and that was putting a lot of pressure we felt on the management of that. And the concern we had, I think, was that as you try and work through and arbitrate through those competing requirements, that could add some delay. We were well aware of the work that was going on in SaxaVord. It felt like we had an opportunity to move to SaxaVord, allow Sutherland to focus on Orbex. We could then work with SaxaVord, work with them closely to deliver what we needed to do, and it felt like that was a way of actually reducing some of the risk for both ports as much as possible.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'm just wondering, therefore, when we can maybe expect the first launch from Lockheed Martin. I mean, if you want to exclusively reveal to this committee that you're going to be the first launch from SaxaVord, feel free to do so. But could you give us some sort of indication about how you expect this to work? We've heard obviously from SaxaVord and the other companies involved here, but like what is your intention, and when would you expect to see something go up into space from Scotland?
So we're working with a company called ABL Space Systems, who have developed a rocket. They're a US-based company. We've invested in them. We invested in them some time ago, and we have a sort of significant contract with them for some of our own internal launches. So to some extent, we're dependent on how well their development goes. And I think we've heard more generally, launch is still complex. I think a lot of people are quite complacent about how difficult launching satellites can be because we see it relatively routinely. It's still a complex initiative, and it still takes a lot of investment, a lot of work to happen. ABL actually had their first launch attempt in January last year. They had a successful
Californian-based, I'm reading in my notes here.
California-based, yeah. They had their first launch attempt from Alaska, actually, in January last year. It launched successfully, I think, for 10 seconds, at which point it then failed. So they've been working hard to rectify the faults they found in that and go through their own fault rectification, and they're looking to launch early this year. I believe their return to flight will be imminent. I don't think they're declared yet, but we're talking weeks when they're hoping to go to their return to flight. Our schedule for launching from SaxaVord will then be dependent on how that goes, because we need to make sure that they have a mature solution, which we have high confidence will launch. We'll then look to launch. We are hoping that we'll be able to launch this year with ABL from SaxaVord.
Well, that's very encouraging, because I think then SaxaVord were telling us that summer would be the first launch, so you would be amongst the first, hopefully, from SaxaVord then, if that is going to be the case.
I think from an orbital perspective, we hope to be one of the first orbital. It will all depend on how well some of those other providers actually go, and we're delighted actually to hear just how much interest there is in SaxaVord. The progress we're seeing from Rocket Factory Augsburg and HyImpulse, who are going to be here, is fantastic. We think that's brilliant for the UK. We are essentially a customer of launch services, and the more options we have, the better it is for us. So we would like to think we'll be the first, along with our partners ABL, but if someone beats us to it, we only see that as being good.
Obviously, we're here, and I know you were listening intently to our previous witnesses from the spaceport stations. I mean, how are your relationships with the facilities in Scotland? Is there anything that you observed that you would like to see improved, or anything you might suggest to them so that business for yourself might be made all that more easier and convenient?
No, I think it's fair to say, and I know Scott's behind me, so he'll have a view as well, I'm sure, as will David. From our perspective, we've had nothing but strong support from all the potential spaceports and launch providers who are looking to operate out of Scotland. They've all been very receptive, all been keen to find a way they can work with us. At the moment, we're clearly looking to use ABL as our partners and looking to launch from SaxaVord. But as I said, we're a consumer of launch services, and we're open to looking to work with anyone from anywhere, quite frankly. I'm very interested in the UK, and I see huge viability in the Scottish spaceports, so I'm very focused on how we can build a relationship with them. So far, I've felt personally there's been no issue with us having these conversations with any of the potential launch providers or spaceports out of Scotland.
Excellent, thank you for that. Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Chairman, and sorry I missed the first panel. I had a constituency matter to attend to. Just looking at the skills and education needed for a successful space sector, particularly the launch sector. In your experience, do Scottish workers have the skills required to support a successful launch sector, or do you have to rely on overseas workers?
I think it's fair to say that at the moment there are still challenges for skills across the UK space sector. I think we'd be naive to say anything but that. I would say over the last 5 years, because of the efforts that have been going on to develop these spaceports, we are very rapidly growing the expertise in the UK. Part of what we tried to do, bringing in our expertise, was to see how we could bring in a lot of the experts from the US to come across and help provide advice and guidance, because we have that heritage. I can tell you there's less and less of that required as both the launch providers and the spaceports are developing their own skills internally. I can tell you within our own UK launch team, I do have someone who has come across from the oil and gas, so we are finding adjacencies as well and just using a bit of time to bring them up to speed. But that's as it stands at the moment. We've heard about the opportunities for scaling up. It has taken quite some time to build up the skills and the expertise we're reliant on at the moment. Some of the spaceport providers have talked about how they brought people in from adjacencies. They spent a lot of time trying to build up that skills set and expertise. If you want to rapidly scale, there is going to be a challenge in trying to do that again. There's also an economic burden for doing that as well at the moment. As you're sort of growing, you have possibly a little bit more capacity in that. When you move very quickly into execution operations, where actually you need everyone to be very focused on just outputs, because that's revenue generating, being able to build within what has to be a lean organization. These spaceports and space launch providers will have to run very competitively, very lean. Being able to have the capacity in that structure to keep maintaining and generating the skills, I think, will be a challenge. So what I'd say is I think we need to maintain quite a high level of focus on it. I believe we do have the expertise and skills within the spaceports now to get that first launch. Bearing in mind, a number of the launch providers will bring some of their own skills over. So in our case, we'll have a number of people come across from ABL, a lot of people who have come across from the US who have done this. That'll be the same for people like Rocket Factory Augsburg. I'm sure will bring their own people over who have been developing expertise. The spaceports themselves have their experts, but trying to grow that, I think, is going to be a challenge. The only other point I would make is the sustainability of these spaceports will also be reliant on the demand that we can pull through. So we also need to think about the skills in trying to pull into the wider ecosystem, because there's no point in having spaceports if we're not building the satellites, and you won't build the satellites if there isn't a requirement for the data being used and consumed and building and the entrepreneurs that come behind that. So I think we can probably get through the first few launches. Scaling up will be a challenge, But are we going to have the skills required to build a broader ecosystem to keep that demand going? I think that's a wider question. I don't think we're quite there yet.
So it's going to be most likely a rapidly growing sector, so the skills need to keep pace with that growth. Just looking at the fact that space is a reserved matter for the UK government, but some devolved powers to the Scottish Government, education, training and business support, for example, have a bearing on that sector. The Prime Minister announced last year about the new advanced standard for English schools for education in terms of technical education and so on. Maths up to 18, I think. Am I right? Is it 18? Yes. Important when it comes to this sort of sector. What more do you think the UK and the Scottish governments, bearing in mind that education has devolved, what more do you think the UK and the Scottish governments can do to ensure that launch companies can find the necessary skilled workforce in Scotland?
I'm speaking more from a broader space perspective. We're a broader space company rather than a launch provider or a spaceport. So I'll give you a general response. There's no doubt that just trying to stimulate those sort of STEM and STEAM-related curriculum in schools is incredibly important to generate the right level of skills we have going forward. My own personal view, though, is I think there's sometimes too much focus on that, and we're missing the opportunity to pull in from adjacencies and open up some of those gateways that allow people to come in from other sectors and to move across. And in some instances, actually help some people who probably later on in life hadn't realized just how much they have the right attributes for some of these types of roles, and we don't have the gateway open to them. So I personally would like to see a bit more emphasis on some of those opportunities for gatewaying out of other sectors and moving across into some of the more engineering and technical. I have seen some interesting uses of technology to try and help map attributes of certain individuals and help them probably realize that they have the attributes to be far more technical than probably they thought they were, because later on in life they've actually come to realize that's more of where their personal attributes are. I think there's probably some more emphasis we could be doing on that. I think the other thing, of course, is the space sector. We get very focused on some of the engineering side of space, and that is clearly we are a technical domain, we are a technical sector. But we also need accountants, we need business development, we need communicators. There is also an element of just how do we publicize the fact that there is a broad set of opportunities available in space. It's interesting, and I'm sure some of my colleagues will say the same thing, if we open up a role in the space sector, we generally get a lot of applicants, especially for some of the technical areas. They don't generally quite have the depth of experience, but they're quite often graduates coming through and desperate to get into the space sector. It becomes a bit harder when you're trying to look for people in some of the other parts of the industry as well, some parts that are not directly related to the engineering and technical side. So it's not just always a technical skill set issue that we have. It's just trying to make sure that people understand space is open to a full range of skill sets. And I think a lot of people, especially at the early stages of education, believe it's all technical in space, and therefore they shut any idea off of going into the space sector completely and then probably move into a different area. And I think we've got to try and let people know that, yes, space is technical, but there are lots of other opportunities in space as well.
It's not just about science, it's about they need nurses and doctors and
need everything, right the way across the full skills. And I think what I do believe is if we manage to open that up a little bit, I think there'll be some people who probably later on in life may not have gone down a technical area, but if they do understand that space is open to them as sector, may move later and could find actually they then move back into a technical field which becomes relevant because they knew it was open to them. So I think it's just trying to let people know that space is, and I know the UK Space Agency have done a big campaign on this, is open to everyone.
Just looking at that, so I've just asked a question about what more can the UK and Scottish governments do. Bearing in mind that employer-led education is really important, what could the space sector companies do together to do a 5-year, a 10-year plan about what skills they need to build their businesses and to keep pace with the growing sector?
And others may have more detail. There has been quite a bit of work that's been done by the Space Agency trying to do that. And I think the space sector has offered some views on the kind of roles they need. So I think there is some data being pulled together that does give more of an analysis on what those skills may be. I think the challenge always comes from then how do you start addressing some of those skills shortfalls? And you know, we've got to recognise the sector, we're not alone. I think every technology sector is suffering in the same ways, and there is huge adjacencies between, you know, software development and some of those things that we need on you know, development of AI engineers and those kind of things. A lot of those skills are the same ones we need in the space sector as well, and there's going to be a lot of overlap between them. But I think possibly, and we've heard it earlier already, I think, you know, there's probably more that we could be doing from a sector trying to spearhead the campaign around how some of those skill sets could lead to a fruitful career, an interesting career, and we could probably put space more at the forefront of that. For whatever reason, although it does resonate well, possibly there's more we could still do.
Thank you.
Just,
no further questions.
Sorry, just one more thing that I think we probably, and it comes into the work that's being done on the space sector policy. I think the other thing that's sometimes missed, and it was mentioned, is I know when I've recruited people, there's probably 2 or 3 companies in the UK that every person who's got space experience has worked for at some point. I think we probably don't recognise quite enough how important it is to do some of that industry-led training. We've heard already that, you know, people are trying to absorb that training as much as they can. I don't think there's enough recognition either in some of the funding that's being put in to allow companies to do that, or sometimes in some of the contracts that you will receive. You know, there should be a recognition if you do get a contract, it's a government contract, there should be some recognition and some premium put in there to allow you to develop the skills, probably over and above what you need directly for that one contract, but possibly with an eye on generating a level of skills that then pushes out into the broader ecosystem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Smith, you mentioned at the outset that Lockheed Martin indeed is a huge global player in the space sector, and you've got a significant UK footprint already. But just to sort of just revisit some of the things that you've touched on, how do you see that Lockheed Martin footprint developing in the years to come, specifically within the space sector, you know, within Scotland? And what does that look like in terms of relationships with R&D or manufacturing facilities and so on? I know there's a lot of focus around launch today, but I'd just like to sort of try and tease out with you what you think that, you know, Lockheed Martin presence could look like.
And at the moment, most of our activity for Scotland is focused around launch and what we're doing in launch. It's been publicly recognised. We've recently started putting some more emphasis into the northeast of England as well. We're looking at that as a hub for us, and we have some hubs existing already. The best I can offer at this stage is we will go wherever it works from us from a business perspective. So wherever there is and I'm carefully using the term incentive, because incentive is not just financial, but where is there access to skills, where is that all right ecosystem building up, where is the best place to operate from, you know, all those things are going to be part of our analysis. We are at an early stage of growing our space business in the UK. Although we have an existing footprint here, they're mainly focused on the other parts of our business. But we are at an early stage of growing our space business, so we're still looking at the right locations to operate from. And there'll be a lot of factors that will come into where that should be. Our interest in launch will be part of that.
Yeah. Again, just as part of an inquiry at the early stages, we visited a couple of, in fact, actually 3 manufacturing development players in the west coast of Scotland. So the impression that I certainly got on that visit was that we're seeing the emergence, in fact, been established for some time now, of an existing cluster. And so potentially that's something to add to. But going and talking about people and drawing a parallel with the North Sea, I hate talking about the North Sea when I'm sat next to a resident expert, but you know, some people would talk to me about when the North Sea was developing, there was an influx, particularly from the United States, of people that had specific skills. And then we got to a point actually, and that is now, where if you go to Azerbaijan or parts of Nigeria, you'll have more burns nights taking place than you do, dare I say, even in Douglas Ross's constituency. But are we likely to see that develop, where we have, you know, maybe some, you know, influx of skills and expertise, particularly maybe from the likes of yourselves from the United States, but if we get it right and we develop that cluster and that core within Scotland, in years to come we could see that outward movement of talent, because these are the people who are actually global leaders within their own field. Absolutely,
and I think actually, you know, I would offer then actually the position that should be taken is how do you make that happen rather than would we see this happen? How do we proactively actually make that happen? I'll tell you from as the UK guy working for a US headquartered company, that's very much my aspiration is how do I build a UK focused part of the company that's going to export from here into a number of markets that are easier access from here than possibly some of my colleagues on the US side can do. That's very much part of what we're trying to do with this with our space footprint. So I would actually encourage you to take a view of how do we actually make that look? How do we incentivize some of that early expertise influx with a view that then we create both IP and the intellectual capital in region to then that make it a hub to go elsewhere. That should be a key part of a strategy.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just ask what you feel the government could do more to support the viability of the Scottish space sector?
I'll probably just sort of reflect on things that have been said already. I think we've part of the challenge at the moment, I think, in the UK is there is this view that somehow we can let market forces lead the way, and if you somehow just put the right small levers in place, the market force will take care of themselves, and through that, we'll get some sort of global advantage. But as we've heard already, part of the challenge, of course, is space as a sector across the globe, operates outside of standard market forces, and there's some level of intervention at every level, pretty much in every strategic space sector globally. So the question is, what's that level of intervention? I do believe there is some advantage in having anchor contracts. Through government. There was a question about what are those benefits, and I think that was well responded to. I think the trick is to find out what are those services that are already the responsibility of governments, be they devolved or in case of Westminster, what are those responsibilities of government where the services from space can actually improve the delivery of those to the public. I think you identify those and then you try and drive the programs through that deliver some enhancements in that. I think we as a sector probably haven't done a good enough job in identifying where those are. I think we probably know them, but I think that's definitely something that can be done. I think with those anchor contracts, you then start seeing that base of demand come through. So I think that's important. I think the other thing that's really important with some of those contracts could be how do you take some elements of early development technology and actually flight prove it. I think if you're going to go to a global market, you need to have heritage in some of that technology. Again, that's a role that governments could take. So I think there's a role in that. I think there is also, as you've heard already, something around, how do you try and streamline the regulation as much as possible? And I think, Scott already offered some really good examples of where that could be done as well. Because, as we've heard, launch is going to be an export, and therefore it needs to be globally competitive. And that's as much about ease of doing business as it is cost of doing business. So I think anything we can do to try and improve that. The final thing I'll just mention on it probably could be a separate question, but I think it links into this, is around the strategies. I think, we've talked a little bit about the strategies so far. I think one of the challenges with the strategies, I've seen them, is a lot of focus on what we do very well right now and build on that. I think the risk of that is, what that means is you're trying to fight a piece of the market you've already got. I think one of the real tricks is how do you look at where the markets are going in the future, and how do you possibly get ahead of where some of these new emerging space markets are. And I think a little bit of analysis on that. I recognise from something that I think it was in the AAC Clyde submission, they talked about things like lunar services. I think that's going to be an emerging market. I think in-orbit manufacturing is going to be an emerging market. I think rather than focus on what you do very well right now, I think it's where do we think we can actually get ahead of a market that isn't quite there yet? Because the reality is a number of other countries are investing heavily in space, and they're going to dominate if you can't get there first.
Where exactly are they investing? Because we've heard lots of talk, direct investment, government contracts, and obviously that's been said to us repeatedly in this inquiry. This is something that the sector are saying is important, that will allow it to develop and break out a bit more. But what are other governments doing to support their sectors? How are they directly investing into what activity there is in their nation?
I think it varies across where countries are in their current development. I mean, if we look across, and a lot of other people have views. I'll offer what I've seen as well from my look across Europe. you have some very developed space economies in Europe, France, Germany, Italy, to some extent Spain. Quite often what they're doing is they're using large government contracts to sustain the industrial base, especially in the upstream, with a view that then they can then generate some of the skills and knowledge to be able to deliver in some of the downstream revenue areas. They do that through very established space agencies. They do their own large national programs in Earth observation. They sometimes do it in collaboration with the European Commission or through European Space Agency, but they're very much focused on how they can drive that investment directly into their industrial base. When you look at some of the emerging space nations, what they're actually looking for is very large-scale, very ambitious, deep space kind of programs. You look to the Middle East, who are desperately looking at options for lunar landers or thinking about deep space probes. So what they're trying to do is sort of large-scale programs that allows them very rapidly to develop some skill sets. Alongside that, they are demanding every contractor who's sort of assisting in some of these areas to deliver large training packages as well. So they are very much trying to build up their industrial capacity and their expertise. The other thing we haven't, it's been touched on, but we haven't gone into any detail yet, of course, is a lot of this is being driven by defence. And a lot of if you look at where the domination, sort of the global expenditure goes, a lot of that, quite frankly, is in defence. And a huge chunk of that is the US government. And they are buying lots of technology, and that sustains quite a large industrial base, which can turn itself to commercial endeavours and deep space endeavours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your evidence so far. Can I just get your assessment of where Scotland is? We're in 2024 now. We've heard a lot about both Sutherland and SaxaVord. Their geography is what makes them attractive. That geography hasn't changed in the last few years. Are we, on progress, on target in terms of being ahead of other countries across Europe and the world? Are we behind, and for what reasons? Where is Scotland in the space race?
Very hard to, this becomes a bit of a personal speculation, I guess, and I'm sure there's lots of data being gathered to give you different metrics on it. I'll just offer this observation. What I would say is, if you'd have asked me 4 years ago, I'd have said Scotland is out front. I would say possibly that position has been slightly eroded through a range of reasons, just because of the pace of what's going on elsewhere in the world. And I think, I think you can probably include the broader UK space sector in that as well. The reality is other countries, quite frankly, are outspending the UK in trying to bolster its space sector. It's just the way it's going. They see it for a couple of reasons. I think it used to be very much around the economic benefits that come from the space sector. Everyone recognises, the productivity element that comes from the space sector, the skills that come from it. So there was a lot of investment taking place in countries to try and deliver that economic benefit. But that has also shifted slightly to a security aspect as well. Everyone recognises that actually for most nations, space is non-discretionary. If you want to maintain the way we live our lives today, you need to have space. You are absolutely reliant in our day-to-day lives on space. If you as a nation can't secure your access to space and your ability to operate from space, then actually you're probably not serving your public as well as you should be. And I think a lot of nations are recognising that and trying to generate their space sector and support their space sector. So I think, quite frankly, a lot of other countries are outspending us. I think from a UK perspective, I think Scotland is still in a very strong position. I think we see a level of entrepreneurship in Scotland that we probably don't see elsewhere across the UK, and I think that has put it in a very strong position. I think what we're seeing in the Spaceport is a really good example of that. The trick is to make sure that it maintains that advantage.
For Scotland to get back up that league table, it would require greater investment by both governments, presumably. You're speaking about a cash injection to prioritise that sector over other areas. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'm always reluctant to talk about just throwing more money at things. It isn't just in money. We've heard other opportunities. We've heard other suggestions as well about how you can do that. Better ties up with academia. Interesting concepts around how you bring in some of the necessary skill sets. Is there something around ease of influx of expertise into that area? Is there something around regulations? It's a myriad of things, but I think it's a prioritisation of that from a government perspective. So is the space sector important enough that you're going to prioritise all those different streams, probably in the next few years, to make sure you get the advantage, the competitive advantage? There's been talk around the need for a space minister. Again, my view on this is I think we are in a global space race. And I think if we want to maintain an advantage in that global space race, we need a real focus on the space sector in the next 5 to 10 years. Once we have that and it normalizes and we have the infrastructure in place, you could then expect space to normalize itself as another sector. But if we do feel that space is important, and for the reasons I said before about I don't believe space is discretionary for any nation, I do believe it's important, we should put the level of priority on it over the next few years, get it into a very strong position. I think then you can move to whatever is the next priority, and you'll have the infrastructure in place for that sustainment going forward.
So to do that, and that reprioritisation means that other services, other government departments will potentially have to have less investment. Are the public on side with this, do you think, in Scotland or across the UK, to understand that need for investment? And you know, how does that compare with other countries around Europe and the world?
I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face in this is just helping the public understand how important space is to our day-to-day lives and how we operate. I think quite often as a sector we're quite insular. You know, we talk about how important we are and we have that sort of echo chamber. We all pat each other on the back and talk about how great we are. I'm not sure we've done a good job of really relaying that to the public. Because, of course, if the public understand it, they'll then understand whether it's worth a prioritisation. And quite frankly, at some point, the public needs to decide on whether this should be important to them. But I don't think they have all the facts to be able to understand that. In comparison to other nations, I think where there is an existing strong established industrial sector, and I think in some of those established European nations, I think it becomes less then around a security conversation as much as it is an economic conversation. We already have strong existing industries. We're going to support those, and that's very easy. I think in the US, the public recognises the security element far more and is happy to support the security aspect. They see security in space to be equivalent to security in the other domains as well, and they feel that actually a threat there is a threat to their sort of national interests. And I think that's why in the US they can have that debate far more easily publicly. I don't think yet we've either won either the economic benefit case with the UK public or the security case with the UK public on why space is important.
Thank you, Chair.
Brian. Thanks, Chair. You've mentioned a couple of times about streamlining regulations. So obviously, this has been outlined, Lockheed Martin that operate on an international basis. So how, at the moment, as it stands, how competitive is the UK and Scottish regulatory environment?
I'll sort of start by saying I'm not the expert in this. Thankfully, we have lots of people who get involved in this. I would just offer the following, again, observation on this. What I would say is, if you'd have asked me this question 3 years ago, I'd have probably had a very different response. What I'd say now is, what we get a sense from the regulator is they are maturing rapidly, and I think they have the right approach to how they're going to do these regulations. They understand that what they put in place can't be too burdensome, either financially or from schedule, but there is a certain amount of expertise they need to build up themselves to get there. So I would say they're definitely moving in the right direction. I think there's still some concerns over the time it takes. There's some concerns over, I think Scott mentioned a couple of really good observations. One of the things we've seen as well is this constant need for directors of companies constantly having to give them their financial data. There's small things they're just trying to get used to, but I think that'll get streamlined. So I think they're moving in the right direction. Again, like everything else, the trick now is not to get too complacent, is to continue to have a focus on making sure that the regulations and licensing process is as streamlined as possible, and constantly just make sure that what we're doing is staying competitive. And just coming back to industry and, again, constantly asking for those questions, I think we've seen a regulator now who's far more open to those conversations than we probably saw 2 or 3 years ago.
Is there, on that wider international comparison, is there any countries that you think are a model in terms of the regulations?
Not that jump out, because we clearly are very, very familiar with the US system through the FAA. That has a lot of heritage, but equally with that comes a lot of baggage where it's built up processes that probably were as relevant 50 years ago, and they're probably not quite as relevant now, so they've got to go through some transformation. So I think there's some best practice you can take. Probably some of the emerging nations probably have some interesting things to take, but I couldn't, hand on heart, point to one particular country. I think we're taking the right approach. We just need to make sure that we don't become too burdensome or too bloated.
And from what you said there, I take it, seem to suggest that with the CA and as a space regulator, things are moving forward, better working relationships. Is there anything else that they can do that can actually, you know, assist yourselves?
Nothing that I could offer right now, but I know we have given thoughts back in through the team, specifically around. But the part we're licensing is I talked about. Second part of our project is to license what we're calling an orbital manoeuvring vehicle, which will be essentially a spacecraft which will deliver smaller satellites, and that will operate as a spacecraft itself. So we've had to license that. So we have been through the process, and we've actually, you know, as we've gone through that, we found the process improved, and we've constantly provided feedback through it. So we have been providing feedback into the CEA, and they have been responding.
Okay, and just go back to, you said there's no other country that stands out as a model of regulation that's more competitive. So does that mean by default, if we're able to streamline the regulations adequately and continue to speed up process, that would give the UK and Scotland that competitive advantage? It
will do. And again, I've got to be careful because I don't claim to be an expert at this, and there are other people across the UK I would definitely point you to. I would say that it's not just, you know, there's an element of making sure it's not financially burdensome. We don't have too many hurdles in what you have to do through the process and the time it takes. There will be other nations where you will be able to license a spacecraft far more easily, I'm sure. The question is whether you would want to license a spacecraft out of that country. So there are other elements that the UK brings with it, and we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't get to the point where we sort of race to the bottom on them, but we've got to make sure we don't become too burdensome. So at the moment, I think it's in a good position.
I take that point, safety is paramount, and look at what's happening with some of the Boeings at the moment. So, yeah.
And I think the focus, you know, on sustainability is resonating well within the market. You know, we are hearing some positive response from some of the investment markets around this push on sustainability. I think no company wants to find itself, you know, operating in a way that would be seen by the public to be somehow not operating in the best interest of the sustainability of space. So I think we are seeing the market respond well to sustainability as a key component of some of those licensing objectives. We've got to be careful it doesn't become too burdensome. But I think at the moment, my sense is we're definitely moving in the right direction, but we can't be complacent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Even though you were on your own, I think we managed to get quite a lot of our questions answered and a bigger understanding of your sector. But unless there's anything else for this afternoon, thank you very much for attending, as are other witnesses. And order.